Everyone in Brookhaven, Georgia, thought they knew Ruth Kimball. 62 years old, church-going, worked at the same pharmacy for 35 years. When she vanished on a Tuesday afternoon in October 1973, along with her boss, Diane Cosgrove, the town searched for weeks. They dragged ponds, combed forests, questioned drifters. The pharmacy stood empty, its door open, the cash register untouched. 38 years later, a federal accountant reviewing old Medicaid records noticed something impossible. Prescriptions continued being filled at Brookhaven Pharmacy for 18 months after both women disappeared. Someone had been operating that pharmacy in secret, and what investigators discovered about Ruth's brother would shatter everything this small Georgia town believed about family loyalty. If you want to hear cold cases that defy expectations, subscribe to Greg's Cold Files. Part 1. The call came into the Brookhaven Police Department at 2:47 p.m. on Tuesday, October 16, 1973. "There's nobody at the pharmacy," Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard told the dispatcher, her voice tight with confusion. "The door's unlocked, lights are on, but nobody's here. I need my husband's heart medication." Officer Dennis Wade arrived 7 minutes later. The pharmacy sat on Claremont Avenue, a 2-story brick building with large front windows displaying advertisements for Anacin and Breck shampoo. A hand-painted sign above the door read, "Kimball's Pharmacy, Esther, 1938. Wade pushed through the front door, triggering the brass bell. The interior smelled like every small-town pharmacy in America: rubbing alcohol, mint, the faint vanilla sweetness of compounded medications. The shop was narrow, maybe 20 feet across, with wooden shelves lining both walls. "Hello?" Wade called out. "Diane? Miss Ruth?" No response. He walked toward the pharmacy counter at the back. A prescription pad lay next to a coffee cup, still warm. Behind the counter, he could see the compounding area: shelves of amber bottles, a mortar and pestle, measuring equipment arranged with meticulous precision. The register drawer was closed. Wade stepped around the counter, noting the daily log book lay open, entries recorded up to 1:15 p.m. in Ruth Kimball's careful script: Mrs. J. Patterson, refill, 4428, digitalis, Mr. R. Cole, new RX, 4429, penicillin, 250 milliliters, Miss A. Turner, refill, 4430, phenobarbital. Nothing appeared disturbed. Wade moved toward the back of the store, where a doorway led to the stockroom. The door stood open. The stockroom was maybe 12 feet square, lined with metal shelving units. Cardboard boxes stacked against one wall. A small desk occupied the far corner. The back door, heavy steel with a deadbolt, stood slightly ajar. Wade noticed it immediately: a dark stain on the concrete floor, roughly 2 feet from the back door. He crouched down. Blood. Fresh enough that it hadn't fully dried, forming a tacky pool about 6 inches in diameter. Next to it lay the shattered remains of a small amber bottle. Wade could make out part of the label: "Orphine sulfate 15 milliliters." He stood up, hand moving to his service revolver, and pushed the back door fully open. It led to a narrow alley behind the commercial buildings. A 1971 Plymouth Duster, pale yellow, sat parked against the building. Wade recognized it as Diane Cosgrove's car. The driver's side door was closed. No other vehicles in sight. Wade returned inside and radioed for backup. Within an hour, every police officer in Brookhaven's small department had converged on the pharmacy. Chief Harold Brennan, a stocky man of 53, stood in the stockroom examining the blood stain. "Not enough blood for a fatal injury," Officer Tommy Vickers said. "Could be defensive wound, somebody getting cut during an altercation." Brennan knelt by the blood. "Or could be unrelated. Box cutter accident, something like that. But the timing's wrong for coincidence." Diane Cosgrove's car yielded nothing useful. Keys were not in the ignition. Her purse sat on the passenger seat, wallet intact, $17 inside, driver's license, family photos. No signs of disturbance. By 4 p.m., Chief Brennan had assembled the basic facts. Diane Cosgrove, 28, had purchased Kimball's pharmacy 14 months earlier, in September 1972. She was a licensed pharmacist, divorced, mother of 2 children, Kyle, age 7, and Jennifer, age 4. She'd moved to Brookhaven from Atlanta after her divorce, looking for a quieter life and a business opportunity. Ruth Kimball, 62, had worked at the pharmacy since 1938, when her father originally owned it. She'd stayed on through her brother Marcus's ownership and had agreed to continue working for Diane. Ruth was widowed, lived alone in a small house on Sycamore Street, was active at First Baptist Church. The pharmacy opened at 9 a.m. that Tuesday. Several customers had come and gone throughout the morning and early afternoon. The last confirmed sighting was Mrs. Dorothy Chen at approximately 1:20 p.m. "Ruth rang me up," Mrs. Chen told Officer Vickers during her interview. "She seemed perfectly normal. Diane was in the back. I could hear her talking to someone on the phone. I paid, Ruth put the medicine in a paper bag, and I left." "Did you notice anyone unusual around the store?" "No, it was a quiet afternoon." By evening, when neither woman had returned and neither could be reached by phone, Chief Brennan made the decision to treat this as a potential abduction case. The investigation expanded rapidly over the next 48 hours. Diane's ex-husband, Robert Cosgrove, was located in Atlanta. He worked as an insurance adjuster for State Farm, had remarried 6 months earlier, and hadn't spoken to Diane in 3 weeks. On October 16th, Robert had been in a morning sales meeting at the State Farm offices on Peachtree Street, with 12 witnesses confirming his presence from 9 a.m. through 3 p.m. "We didn't part on great terms," Robert admitted during his interview, "but I wouldn't hurt her. She's the mother of my kids." When Brennan asked if Robert would take his children if Diane couldn't care for them, Robert's eyes filled with tears. "Of course I would. They're staying with us now. Kyle keeps asking when his mom's coming home, and I don't know what to tell him." Marcus Kimball, Ruth's brother and the pharmacy's previous owner, proved more difficult to locate. Marcus was 59 years old, a Korean War veteran who'd received a Purple Heart after taking shrapnel in his left leg during the Battle of Heartbreak Ridge in 1951. He'd owned Kimball's pharmacy from 1965 until selling it to Diane in September 1972. "Marcus hasn't been the same since Korea," Ruth's neighbor, Mrs. Alice Davenport, told Chief Brennan. "He came back with that leg injury, and the pain never really stopped. He took pills for it, prescription medications, all legal and proper, but I think they got a hold of him." Marcus's last known address was an apartment above a hardware store on Madison Street, but he'd moved out in May 1973. The landlord said Marcus had left owing 2 months' rent. "He cleared out in the middle of the night," the landlord said. "Took everything with him." "Where did he go?" "No idea. He mentioned Florida once, said he had friends down in Jacksonville." A check with the Georgia Department of Motor Vehicles showed Marcus owned a 1968 Chevrolet C10 pickup truck, dark green. No recent registration renewal, no known employment since selling the pharmacy. Chief Brennan sent inquiries to police departments in Jacksonville, Savannah, and Augusta, but none reported any contact with Marcus Kimball. The forensic analysis came back on October 19th. The blood in the stockroom was type O positive, matching Ruth Kimball's medical records. Diane's blood type was B negative. The amount of blood suggested a superficial injury, not life-threatening. The shattered morphine bottle was standard pharmaceutical stock, 15 millimoles morphine sulfate tablets, a Schedule II controlled substance kept in the pharmacy's locked narcotics cabinet. The cabinet showed no signs of forced entry, but it hadn't been locked when police arrived. The back door's lock showed no signs of tampering. It had been either unlocked or opened with a key. Brennan thought about Marcus Kimball, somewhere in Florida or Georgia, possibly still carrying keys to his former business. By the end of October, the case had become Brookhaven's most pressing mystery. Search parties combed the woods surrounding the town. Volunteers dragged the Chattahoochee River. State police issued bulletins with descriptions of both women. The GBI sent 2 agents to assist. The theories multiplied, but 2 rose to the top. Theory 1. Marcus had returned, wanting money or angry about the sale. Perhaps Ruth had refused to help him, and Diane had gotten in the way. Marcus had military training, access to the building, motive. Theory 2. A robbery attempt gone wrong. Someone had entered through the back door intending to rob the narcotics cabinet. Violence had ensued. But this theory had problems. Nothing was stolen, and the narcotics cabinet remained substantially stocked. A third possibility emerged during the investigation, one that investigators found both compelling and troubling. Dr. Raymond Fletcher, Diane's physician in Atlanta, revealed during questioning that Diane had called him 2 days before her disappearance. She'd wanted advice about reporting suspected prescription fraud to the DEA. "She didn't give me specifics," Dr. Fletcher told Chief Brennan, "but she said she'd noticed discrepancies in the controlled substances inventory. Medications that should have been there weren't. She wanted to know the proper procedure for reporting it." "Did she say she knew who was responsible?" "No, she said she needed to verify a few more things before making accusations." This opened a new avenue. Had Diane discovered someone was stealing from the pharmacy? Had that someone silenced her and Ruth to cover their tracks? But without locating Marcus or finding the women or identifying another suspect, the theory remained speculation. On November 3rd, Chief Brennan drove to Atlanta to speak with Robert Cosgrove, not to question him again, but to inform him that the investigation had stalled. "We're doing everything we can," Brennan said, sitting in Robert's living room in Buckhead. "But without witnesses, without a crime scene that tells us what happened, we're working blind." Robert's jaw tightened. "You think they're dead?" "I think we need to prepare for all possibilities." Robert stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street where his children were playing with the neighbors' kids. Kyle was riding a bicycle, Jennifer was drawing with sidewalk chalk. Normal childhood activities, except their mother was gone. "Kyle asked me last night if maybe his mom went to heaven like his grandpa did," Robert said, his voice breaking. "And I didn't know how to answer him. How do you explain to a 7-year-old that his mother might be dead but nobody knows for sure?" Brennan had no answer for that. Before leaving, he asked to see Diane's personal effects. Robert led him to a storage closet where cardboard boxes held clothes, books, and paperwork. "Take whatever you need," Robert said quietly. Brennan brought the boxes back to Brookhaven. Inside, he found Diane's nursing school diploma from Georgia State University, tax returns from 1970, 1972, canceled checks, and a small address book. He spent an evening going through the address book, calling every name listed. One entry caught his attention. Marcus Kimball, 555-0247. Brennan tried the number. Disconnected. Christmas 1973 came and went. Brookhaven tried to move forward, but the absence of 2 women left a hole in the community's fabric. Ruth's house on Sycamore Street stood empty. Her nephew eventually cleared out her belongings and put the house up for sale. It sold in March 1974 to a couple from Columbus. Diane's pharmacy remained closed. Robert Cosgrove attempted to sell the business, but found no buyers. The building stood vacant through 1974, then was leased to a hardware store in 1975. Chief Brennan retired in December 1974. His successor, Chief Arnold Clay, inherited the unsolved case file, now 2 thick folders of reports, interviews, and dead-end leads. In May 1975, a hiker found skeletal remains in the woods near Buford, about 40 miles northeast of Brookhaven. The GBI identified them as a 19-year-old woman from South Carolina who'd been reported missing in 1973. Not Diane, not Ruth. Kyle Cosgrove stood in his father's living room when the news came through on the TV. He was 9 years old. He watched his father's shoulders slump, watched his stepmother Carol put her hand over her mouth. For a brief moment, the family had allowed themselves to hope. Then that hope was extinguished. "It's okay, buddy," Robert said, pulling Kyle into a hug. "We'll keep waiting." But as the years passed, waiting became less about hope and more about resignation. By 1980, the case file had been relegated to a filing cabinet in the basement of the Brookhaven Police Department, alongside other cold cases from decades past. Marcus Kimball was never found. His name appeared on no tax returns, no employment records, no hospital admissions, no death certificates. He'd vanished as completely as his sister and Diane Cosgrove. Kyle and Jennifer Cosgrove grew up in Atlanta, raised by their father and stepmother. They had vague memories of their mother, her voice, her smile, the way she'd made them pancakes on Saturday mornings. But those memories faded with time, replaced by the aching absence of not knowing. "I used to think she'd come home one day," Kyle told a reporter in 1988 when a local TV station did a 15-year retrospective on the case. He was 22 by then, a student at Georgia Tech. "I'd imagine her walking through the door, explaining that it had all been a mistake, that she'd been held somewhere and finally escaped. But that's a kid's fantasy. As an adult, you accept that some questions never get answered." The reporter asked if he thought his mother was still alive. Kyle looked directly at the camera. "No, I don't." Decades passed. Brookhaven grew. The population increased from 6,000 in 1973 to over 15,000 by 2010. The downtown area underwent revitalization. The old pharmacy building was demolished in 2003, replaced by a coffee shop and boutique. Nobody talked about Diane Cosgrove and Ruth Kimball anymore. They'd become a footnote in local history, remembered only by the oldest residents and true crime enthusiasts who occasionally posted about the case on internet forums. Then, in March 2011, a woman named Patricia Wong made a discovery that would change everything. Part 2. Patricia Wong had worked as a claims auditor for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services for 11 years. Her job involved reviewing old Medicaid payment records, looking for patterns of fraud that might have been missed in real time. It was tedious work, the kind that most people found mind-numbing, but Patricia had a talent for spotting anomalies in data. In March 2011, she was assigned to audit Georgia's Medicaid prescription drug program from 1972 to 1975, part of a larger initiative to identify historical fraud patterns that might inform current enforcement strategies. She was working through pharmacy reimbursement records when she noticed something odd about Brookhaven Pharmacy. The pharmacy had submitted claims for controlled substances, morphine, codeine, Demerol, throughout 1973 and into early 1975. Nothing unusual about that, but when Patricia cross-referenced the claims against the pharmacy's business license and ownership records, she found a discrepancy. According to state business records, Diane Cosgrove had purchased the pharmacy in September 1972. But according to local news archives that Patricia found online, Diane Cosgrove had disappeared in October 1973. Yet Brookhaven Pharmacy continued submitting Medicaid claims for another 18 months after Diane's disappearance. Patricia pulled up the specific claims. Between October 1973 and March 1975, Brookhaven Pharmacy had billed Medicaid for 847 prescriptions, totaling $2,341 in reimbursements. The prescriptions were written for various patients, some with legitimate-sounding names, some that Patricia suspected were fabricated. All bore Diane Cosgrove's DEA registration number and pharmacist license number. Patricia sat back in her chair, staring at her computer screen. Either Diane Cosgrove had never actually disappeared and the news reports were wrong, or someone had been operating that pharmacy under her credentials after she vanished. She picked up the phone and called the Fraud Investigation Unit at the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. The call reached Detective Sergeant Michael Torres on March 18, 2011. Torres was 41 years old, a 14-year veteran of the GBI's Major Case Unit. He'd worked everything from organized crime to cold case homicides, but he'd never encountered a case quite like this. He listened to Patricia Wong explain what she'd found, taking notes on a legal pad. "So you're telling me," Torres said slowly, "that this pharmacy was billing Medicaid for a year and a half after its owner disappeared?" "That's correct." "And nobody caught this at the time?" "Medicaid fraud detection in the 1970s wasn't what it is now. Claims were processed manually, oversight was minimal. If the paperwork looked legitimate, payments went through." Torres thanked her for the information and hung up. Then he walked down to the archives room in the basement of the GBI building and requested the case file for Diane Cosgrove and Ruth Kimball. The file was stored in a cardboard box, covered in dust. Torres carried it back to his desk and spent the next 3 hours reading through every report, every witness statement, every piece of evidence collected in 1973. By 5 p.m., he'd formed a working theory. Someone with access to Diane's credentials, her DEA number, her signature stamp, and her prescription pads had continued operating the pharmacy after her disappearance. This person had been filling prescriptions, both legitimate and fraudulent, and collecting Medicaid reimbursements. The operation had continued for 18 months before stopping in March 1975. Why had it stopped? Torres flipped through the file, looking for anything that might explain the timeline. Then he found it. A newspaper clipping from April 1975. The building that housed Brookhaven Pharmacy had been leased to a hardware store. The new tenant had taken possession on April 1, 1975. Whoever had been operating the Phantom Pharmacy had been forced to stop when the building changed hands. Torres picked up the phone and called the Brookhaven Police Department. He spoke with Chief David Carmichael, who'd taken over the department in 2008. "I'm reopening the Cosgrove Kimball case," Torres said. "I need to look at the original crime scene, or what's left of it." "The building's gone," Carmichael said. "Demolished in 2003. It's a coffee shop now." "What about evidence from the original investigation?" "We've got some boxes in storage, physical evidence, blood samples, the broken morphine bottle, some personal effects. I can have someone pull it for you." Torres drove to Brookhaven the next morning. The town had changed significantly since 1973, but some things remained the same. He parked on Claremont Avenue, where a Starbucks now occupied the location of the former pharmacy. He walked inside, ordered a coffee, and sat at a table near the window. He tried to imagine what this space had looked like 38 years ago. The pharmacy counter at the back, the narrow aisles, the stockroom where blood had been found. His phone rang. It was Carmichael. "I've got the evidence boxes ready for you. Also, I pulled the original case file from our archives. There's something interesting in here." "What's that?" "The investigating officer, Chief Harold Brennan, made a note in November 1973. He wrote that Diane Cosgrove had called her physician 2 days before disappearing, asking about how to report prescription fraud to the DEA. Torres felt a spike of adrenaline. Did Brennan follow up on that? According to his notes, yes. He theorized that someone was stealing controlled substances from the pharmacy and that Diane discovered it, but he never identified a suspect beyond Marcus Kimball, who'd disappeared. Torres thanked him and ended the call. Then he opened his laptop and began researching Marcus Kimball. Marcus Edward Kimball, born January 14, 1914, in Brookhaven, Georgia. Drafted into the Army in 1951, served in Korea, received a Purple Heart, returned to Brookhaven in 1952, worked at his father's pharmacy, inherited the pharmacy in 1965 when his father died, sold the pharmacy to Diane Cosgrove in September 1972 for $45,000. Then, nothing. No employment records, no tax filings, no death certificate. Marcus Kimball had effectively ceased to exist in May 1973. Torres pulled up Social Security Administration records. Marcus's Social Security number showed no activity after April 1973, no wages reported, no benefits claimed. Either Marcus had died without anyone filing a death certificate, or he'd gone off the grid entirely. Torres spent the next week diving into the Medicaid fraud angle. He obtained copies of the 847 prescriptions that had been billed to Medicaid between October 1973 and March 1975. Patricia Wong was right. Many of the patient names appeared suspicious. Some were obvious fakes, John Smith, Jane Doe. Others were more subtle fabrications, but some were real. Torres cross-referenced the names against voter registration records, phone directories, and obituary notices from the 1970s. He identified 43 prescriptions that had been filled for actual Brookhaven residents who were alive in 1973-1975. He began tracking down these people or their surviving family members. On April 4, 2011, Torres knocked on the door of a small house on Elm Street in Brookhaven. An elderly man answered, Arthur Webb, 81 years old. Mr. Webb, my name is Detective Torres with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. I'm investigating a cold case from 1973, and I believe you might have information that could help. Webb invited him inside. They sat in a living room filled with photographs of grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Torres pulled out a document. According to Medicaid records, you received a prescription for codeine in November 1973, filled at Brookhaven Pharmacy. Do you remember that? Webb frowned, thinking. November 1973? That was a long time ago. You would have been in your 40s. The prescription was for codeine, 60 tablets. Webb's eyes widened. Oh, yes, I remember. I'd hurt my back working construction. My doctor prescribed something for the pain. Do you remember going to the pharmacy to pick it up? No, I didn't pick it up. It was delivered. Torres leaned forward. Delivered? By whom? A man came to my house, said he was from the pharmacy. He had my prescription in a white paper bag. I paid him. I think it was $8. Can you describe this man? Webb thought for a moment. Older fellow, maybe late 50s. He had a limp, walked with a cane. I remember thinking he shouldn't be making deliveries if his leg was bad. Torres felt his pulse quicken. Did you get his name? No, he just said he was from Kimball's pharmacy. I didn't think anything of it at the time. Torres showed Webb a photograph from 1972, Marcus Kimball's driver's license photo. Webb studied it for a long moment. That could be him. The age is right, but I can't be certain. It was 38 years ago. Torres thanked him and left. He spent the next 2 weeks tracking down 11 more people who'd received prescriptions from Brookhaven Pharmacy after Diane's disappearance. 7 were deceased. 2 couldn't remember anything useful, but 2 others, Mrs. Helen Pritchard and Mr. Donald Hayes, both described the same thing Arthur Webb had, an older man with a limp delivering prescriptions to their homes, collecting cash payments. Marcus Kimball had been operating the pharmacy in secret. Torres returned to the evidence boxes from the original investigation. He examined the blood sample that had been collected from the stockroom floor in October 1973. The original analysis had identified it as type O positive, matching Ruth Kimball. In 2011, DNA analysis was routine. Torres submitted the blood sample to the GBI crime lab for DNA extraction and profiling. 2 weeks later, the results came back. The DNA profile confirmed the blood was from Ruth Kimball, but the lab had also detected something else, a mixture. There was a second person's DNA present in the sample, likely from the person who'd injured Ruth. Torres requested a familial DNA search through Georgia's criminal DNA database. He was looking for a partial match that might indicate a relative of the person who'd been present when Ruth was injured. The search came back with no hits. Dead end. But Torres wasn't finished. He obtained a court order to exhume Ruth Kimball's body. Except there was no body. Ruth had never been found. Her family had held a memorial service in 1975 and erected a cenotaph in the Brookhaven cemetery, but there were no remains to exhume. Torres shifted strategies. If he couldn't find Marcus Kimball through DNA, he'd find him through the money. He obtained financial records for Marcus Kimball from 1972-1973. Bank statements showed that Marcus had deposited the $45,000 from the pharmacy sale into his account at First National Bank of Brookhaven in September 1972. Over the next 6 months, he'd withdrawn the money in increments, $2,000 here, $5,000 there, until the account was nearly depleted by March 1973. Then, in April 1973, a new account was opened at the same bank under the name M.E. Kimball. Torres obtained the records. The account showed regular deposits, $500 to $200 every few weeks, from April 1973 through February 1975. The deposits matched the timeline of the fraudulent Medicaid prescriptions. Torres brought the bank records to a forensic accountant. "Can you trace where these deposits came from?" The accountant examined the records. "These are cash deposits. No checks, no wire transfers. Whoever made these deposits was walking into the bank with cash." "Can you tell me which branch?" "All deposits were made at the First National Bank on Madison Street in Brookhaven." Torres drove to the bank, now a branch of SunTrust, and requested surveillance footage from 1973. He was told that footage from that era had been destroyed decades ago. Another dead end. But then Torres had an idea. He returned to the GBI office and pulled up property records for Brookhaven and surrounding areas. If Marcus had been operating the pharmacy in secret, he needed somewhere to store the medications, somewhere to prepare the deliveries. Torres searched for properties owned or rented by anyone with the last name Kimball between 1973 and 1975. He found one, a storage unit at Brookhaven Self-Storage, rented in April 1973 by M. Kimball. The rental agreement showed monthly payments through March 1975, then the unit was abandoned. The storage facility had eventually auctioned off the contents in 1976 to recover unpaid rent. Torres contacted Brookhaven Self-Storage. The facility was still in business, now under new ownership. He spoke with the manager. "Do you have records from 1976? Specifically, an auction of abandoned storage units?" The manager checked. "We've got old ledgers in the back office. Give me a day to dig through them." The next day, the manager called back. "I found it. Unit 247, auctioned May 1976. Contents purchased by a local antique dealer named George Strickland for $150. Torres tracked down George Strickland. He was 73 years old now, retired, living in Athens, Georgia. "Mr. Strickland, I'm investigating a cold case from the 1970s. I understand you purchased the contents of a storage unit in 1976? Strickland nodded. "I bought dozens of storage units over the years. You're going to have to be more specific." Unit 247 at Brookhaven Self-Storage, May 1976. Strickland thought for a moment. I remember that one. It was full of junk, mostly. Old furniture, boxes of papers. I thought I'd find something valuable, but it was mostly garbage. What did you do with the contents? Threw most of it away, kept a few pieces of furniture that I resold. The papers, I think I used them for packing material. Torres's heart sank. All of them? Well, there was one box I kept. Had some old photographs in it, letters. I'm a bit of a history buff. Thought they might be interesting someday. Do you still have that box? It's in my attic somewhere. Let me look. Torres waited while Strickland rummaged through his attic. 20 minutes later, Strickland returned with a dusty cardboard box. Inside were photographs from the 1940s and 1950s, family pictures of the Kimball family. There were also letters, mostly correspondence between Marcus and his father. And at the bottom of the box, Torres found something that made his breath catch. A ledger. The ledger contained handwritten entries from October 1973 through March 1975. Each entry listed a date, a patient name, a medication, and a dollar amount. It was a record of every prescription Marcus Kimball had filled using Diane Cosgrove's credentials. Torres photographed every page, then carefully placed the ledger in an evidence bag. He now had proof that Marcus had been operating the pharmacy after Diane's disappearance, but he still didn't know what had happened to Diane and Ruth. Torres returned to the original crime scene analysis. The blood in the stockroom suggested an altercation. The shattered morphine bottle suggested someone had grabbed for it or dropped it. The back door had been unlocked or opened with a key. He constructed a timeline. October 16, 1973, approximately 1:20 p.m. Diane and Ruth are in the pharmacy. A customer leaves. Sometime in the next hour, someone enters through the back door. An altercation occurs. Ruth is injured, not fatally, but enough to leave blood on the floor. The morphine bottle is broken. Diane and Ruth are forced to leave the premises, possibly at gunpoint. They are taken somewhere. They are never seen again. Who was the person who entered through the back door? The evidence pointed to Marcus Kimball. He had keys. He had motive. He needed money. And he knew Diane was about to report prescription fraud to the DEA. He had opportunity. He was living off the grid, unaccounted for. But Torres needed more than circumstantial evidence. He needed to find Marcus, or find the bodies, or find someone who knew what had happened. He decided to focus on Marcus's military records. Perhaps Marcus's service in Korea had left a trail that could help locate him. Torres obtained Marcus's military service records from the National Archives. The file included his medical records, which detailed his leg injury from 1951 and subsequent treatment. The records also included psychological evaluations. Marcus had been diagnosed with what was then called combat fatigue, now recognized as PTSD. One document caught Torres's attention. A letter from Marcus to his sister Ruth, written in 1952 while he was still recovering at a VA hospital in Tennessee. In the letter, Marcus described his plans to return to Brookhaven and help run the family pharmacy. He wrote, "I know Father is getting older, and I want to make sure the pharmacy stays in the family. It's all we have, Ruth. It's our legacy." The pharmacy had meant everything to Marcus. And in 1972, facing financial difficulties and addiction to prescription painkillers, he'd been forced to sell it. Torres understood the motive now. Marcus hadn't just lost a business, he'd lost his identity, his purpose, his legacy. When Diane threatened to report fraud, which Marcus was likely committing even before selling the pharmacy, she became a threat not just to his freedom, but to everything he believed he deserved. Torres called a press conference on May 12, 2011. He stood in front of cameras from Atlanta TV stations and local newspapers and he announced that the Cosgrove Kimball case was being actively investigated based on new evidence. "We now believe that Marcus Edward Kimball was involved in the disappearances of Diane Cosgrove and Ruth Kimball in October 1973, Torres said. "We are asking anyone with information about Marcus Kimball's whereabouts after May 1973 to contact the GBI immediately." He displayed a photograph of Marcus from 1972, a grainy driver's license photo showing a man with thinning hair, deep-set eyes, and a stern expression. The press conference aired on the evening news across Georgia. Tips began coming in. Most were useless, people claiming to have seen Marcus in Florida or Texas or California. But one tip stood out. On May 15th, a woman named Carol Henshaw called the GBI tip line. She was 67 years old, lived in Valdosta, Georgia. She said she had information about Marcus Kimball. Torres called her back within an hour. "Mrs. Henshaw, you said you have information about Marcus Kimball." "Yes, I knew him, briefly, in 1973. Torres grabbed a pen. "Go on." "I was working as a motel clerk in Valdosta that year, the Magnolia Inn on Interstate 75. Marcus stayed at the motel for about 2 months, from late October through December." "You're certain it was him?" "I saw his photo on the news. That's him. He paid cash every week, kept to himself. I remember he walked with a limp and carried a cane." "Did he use the name Marcus Kimball?" "No. He checked in as Mark Edwards, but I'm sure it was the same man." "Did he say what he was doing in Valdosta?" "He said he was passing through looking for work. He asked if I knew anyone hiring. I told him about a warehouse that was looking for night shift workers, inventory, loading trucks, that kind of thing. I don't know if he took the job." Torres's mind raced. "What warehouse?" "It was called Southern Distribution. It's closed now, went out of business in the 1980s. Torres thanked her and immediately began researching Southern Distribution. The company had been a regional logistics hub, handling shipments for various manufacturers. Employment records from the 1970s were spotty, but Torres eventually found payroll records stored at the Georgia State Archives. He searched for Mark Edwards in the payroll records from late 1973. There it was. Mark Edwards, hired November 1st, 1973, terminated January 15th, 1974. The address listed on the employment file was the Magnolia Inn. Torres felt a surge of excitement. He now knew where Marcus had been immediately after the disappearances, but he still needed to find out where Marcus had gone after January 1974 and whether he was still alive. He expanded his search, looking for any records under the name Mark Edwards in Georgia, Florida, Alabama, and Tennessee from 1974 onward. He found a driver's license application in Alabama filed in February 1974. Mark Edwards, date of birth, January 14, 1914, Marcus Kimball's birth date. The address was an apartment in Mobile, Alabama. Torres contacted the Mobile Police Department. They had no records of Mark Edwards being arrested or involved in any incidents, but they were able to provide property records showing that Mark Edwards had rented an apartment from February 1974 through August 1976. Then the trail went cold again. No further records under Mark Edwards, no death certificate, nothing. Torres sat at his desk, staring at the timeline he'd constructed. Marcus Kimball had disappeared from Brookhaven in May 1973. He'd reappeared in Valdosta in October 1973, just after Diane and Ruth disappeared. He'd worked under an alias for 2 months, then moved to Mobile, Alabama, where he'd lived for 2 years before vanishing again. Why had he stopped in Valdosta? Why had he worked at a warehouse? Torres pulled up a map, looking at the route from Brookhaven to Valdosta. Interstate 75 ran directly through Valdosta. It was a logical stop on the way to Florida. But if Marcus had been fleeing, why had he stayed for 2 months? And then Torres realized Marcus hadn't been fleeing. He'd been waiting. He'd been waiting for the heat to die down. He'd been waiting to see if anyone connected him to the disappearances. And when no one did, he'd moved on to Mobile, where he'd continued living under an alias for 2 more years. Torres looked at the dates again. Marcus had stopped operating the Phantom Pharmacy in March 1975. He'd left Mobile in August 1976. Why stop in March 1975? Torres already knew the answer. The building had been leased to a hardware store. Marcus could no longer access the pharmacy. But why leave Mobile in August 1976? Torres requested medical records from Mobile hospitals for Mark Edwards. It took 3 weeks to obtain them, but when they arrived, Torres found his answer. Mark Edwards, Marcus Kimball, had been admitted to Mobile General Hospital on July 30, 1976, with advanced lung cancer. He'd been treated with radiation therapy, but the cancer had metastasized. He was released on August 12, 1976, with a prognosis of less than 6 months. Torres sat back in his chair, processing this information. Marcus Kimball had been dying in 1976. He'd left Mobile, presumably to find somewhere quiet to spend his final months. But where had he gone? Torres spent the next month searching for death certificates under both Marcus Kimball and Mark Edwards in Georgia, Florida, Alabama, and surrounding states. He found nothing. Then, in June 2011, Torres received a call from a funeral home director in Apalachicola, Florida. "I saw the news story about Marcus Kimball," the director said. "I think we buried him." "When?" "December 1976, but the name on the death certificate is Mark Edwards." Torres drove to Apalachicola the next day. The funeral home director showed him the records. Mark Edwards, age 62, died December 4, 1976, of lung cancer. Cremated, ashes scattered in Apalachicola Bay. No next of kin listed. Funeral expenses paid in cash. Torres requested a copy of the death certificate. The physician who'd signed it was Dr. Lawrence Chen, who'd been practicing in Apalachicola in 1976. Dr. Chen was now 79 years old, retired. Torres called him. "Dr. Chen, I'm investigating a cold case. I believe a man you treated in 1976 was involved in 2 murders. His real name was Marcus Kimball, but he was using the name Mark Edwards." Dr. Chen was quiet for a moment. "I remember him. He came to my office in October 1976. He was in bad shape. Lung cancer, advanced stage. He didn't want aggressive treatment, just pain management. I prescribed morphine. He died 2 months later." "Did he tell you anything about his past?" "Not much. He was a quiet man. But near the end, when he was heavily medicated, he talked sometimes. He mentioned a sister, said he'd failed her, that he'd let her down." "Did he say how?" "No. He just kept saying he was sorry. I assumed he meant he hadn't been there for her in life. I didn't realize—" Dr. Chen's voice trailed off. Torres thanked him and ended the call. He now had the complete picture. Marcus Kimball had killed his sister Ruth and Diane Cosgrove on October 16, 1973, to prevent them from reporting his prescription fraud to the DEA. He'd operated the pharmacy in secret for 18 months, billing Medicaid and pocketing the money. When the building was leased to someone else in 1975, he'd moved to Mobile and lived under an alias until his cancer diagnosis in 1976. He'd died in Apalachicola, his ashes scattered in the bay, his crimes never discovered. But Torres still didn't know where Diane and Ruth's bodies were. He returned to the original crime scene analysis, looking for any clue about where Marcus might have taken them. The stockroom had a back door leading to an alley. Marcus's truck, a 1968 Chevrolet C10, could have been parked there. He could have forced both women into the truck at gunpoint. But where had he taken them? Torres pulled up aerial photographs of Brookhaven from 1973. He studied the surrounding area, looking for places where bodies could be hidden. Forests, ravines, rivers, abandoned buildings. Then he noticed something: the old Brookhaven rock quarry, about 3 miles east of town. The quarry had been abandoned in the 1960s, and by 1973 it had filled with water, creating a deep pond. Local kids used to swim there, despite warnings from police. Torres drove to the former quarry site. It was now a protected wetland, surrounded by chain-link fencing and no trespassing signs. The water was dark and murky, at least 50 feet deep in the center. Torres contacted the DeKalb County Sheriff's Department and requested a dive team. On July 15, 2011, divers entered the quarry pond. They searched for 3 days. On the third day, they found something: a 1968 Chevrolet C10 pickup truck, dark green, resting on the bottom of the pond in 60 feet of water. Inside the truck's bed, wrapped in tarps and weighed down with cinder blocks, were the skeletal remains of 2 women. DNA analysis confirmed their identities: Diane Cosgrove and Ruth Kimball. The medical examiner determined that both women had died from gunshot wounds to the head. Ruth had also suffered a defensive wound to her left hand, consistent with the blood found in the pharmacy stockroom. Torres held a press conference on July 20, 2011. "After 38 years," he said, his voice steady, "we can finally give Diane Cosgrove and Ruth Kimball the dignity of a proper burial. We know what happened to them. We know who was responsible. Marcus Edward Kimball murdered these 2 women to hide his crimes, and he lived free for 3 more years before dying of cancer in 1976. The press conference was carried live on Atlanta TV stations. In Buckhead, Kyle Cosgrove, now 45 years old, watched with his sister Jennifer beside him. They held hands, tears streaming down their faces. "I always knew she was dead," Kyle said quietly, "but knowing and having proof are different things. Now we can bury her. Now we can say goodbye." Diane Cosgrove and Ruth Kimball were buried in a joint ceremony on August 6, 2011, at Brookhaven Memorial Cemetery. More than 300 people attended, including residents who'd lived in Brookhaven in 1973 and remembered the case. Robert Cosgrove, now 68 years old and in poor health, attended in a wheelchair. He wept openly as his ex-wife's casket was lowered into the ground. Kyle Cosgrove gave a eulogy. He talked about his mother, the woman he'd barely known but always remembered. He talked about the years of not knowing, the burden of uncertainty that had shaped his childhood, and he talked about the importance of truth, even when it comes decades too late. "My mother deserved better than to be forgotten," Kyle said. "She deserved better than to be left in darkness for 38 years. Today, we bring her into the light. Today, we remember her not as a victim, but as a woman who tried to do the right thing. She saw fraud, she wanted to report it, and she paid for that decision with her life. That's not justice, but at least now it's truth." The case of Diane Cosgrove and Ruth Kimball was officially closed on August 15, 2011. Detective Torres submitted his final report to the GBI. The report detailed Marcus Kimball's crimes: 2 counts of first-degree murder, fraud, identity theft, and desecration of human remains. If Marcus had lived, he would have faced life in prison without parole. But Marcus was already dead, his ashes scattered in a Florida bay 15 years before anyone discovered what he'd done. In the end, there was no trial, no conviction, no punishment. Just the truth, preserved in official records and the memories of those who'd lived through it. Kyle Cosgrove kept a photograph of his mother on his desk for the rest of his life. In the photo, Diane is smiling, standing in front of the pharmacy on a sunny day in 1972. She looks happy, optimistic, ready to build a new life in a small Georgia town. She never got the chance, but she was never forgotten. And 38 years after she disappeared, she finally came home.